Unsolved and terrifying murder cases revealed true crime chronicles. A hook. Sure. Here's a gripping hook in English to engage your viewers for the YouTube video. What if everything you've been running from was never meant to be escaped? In this chilling tale, survival isn't just about fleeing the monsters in the shadows. It's about facing something far darker, something that wants more than just your life. Watch until the end and discover the terrifying truth they were never prepared for. It was a cold night. The wind howled through the empty streets. Shadows stretched across the pavement. Rachel walked quickly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. She tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. The streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow on everything. Her heart raced. The hairs on her neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. She quickened her pace. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind her. Rachel froze. A breath. Cold. Too close. She whipped around. Nothing. But she could feel it now. Someone was there, watching. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She kept walking, but slower now, more cautious. The street seemed to stretch on forever. Was it her imagination? No. There it was again. A figure in the distance. A man. Standing still. She couldn't make out his face. Her breath quickened. Was he waiting for her? Why? The silence was suffocating now. She reached for her phone. No signal. Her hand trembled. She had to get away. Her legs moved before her mind could process. She ran. The sound of footsteps followed. Closer now. Faster. Rachel's heart pounded. Her chest burned with every breath. She looked ahead. The alley. A narrow escape. She darted down it, her footfalls harsh against the concrete. The figure was still behind her. She could hear him, the sound of his boots against the ground. Getting closer. Her legs screamed for her to stop. But she couldn't. Not now. She turned a corner, hoping to lose him. But he was there, waiting. She stopped dead in her tracks. The man smiled. It wasn't a smile. It was a grin. Wide. Unsettling. And then he spoke. "I've been waiting for you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. He stepped closer. Her vision blurred. Her body went cold. And then everything went black. She woke up in a dark, damp room. Her head throbbed. Her hands were bound. She couldn't move. Panic surged. Her eyes struggled to adjust. The air smelled musty, stale. A single, dim light flickered above. The walls seemed to close in. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Where was she? What happened? Suddenly, she heard footsteps. Heavy, slow. Her heart raced again. The door creaked open. A figure entered, silhouetted in the doorway. She could barely make out his face. But the smile, it was unmistakable. "You woke up sooner than I expected," he said, his voice low. Rachel tried to scream, but the gag in her mouth muffled the sound. He stepped closer. She twisted in her restraints. Desperation flooded her mind, but her body wouldn't obey. The man knelt in front of her, eyes cold and calculating. "I was hoping you'd make it here," he whispered. Rachel's eyes darted around the room. It was small, barely more than a cellar. Rusty tools lay scattered on the floor. The walls were covered in something dark. Was it blood? Her stomach churned. He reached out, running a cold finger along her cheek. Her skin crawled. His touch was too gentle. He laughed softly, a hollow sound. "You're not the first," he murmured. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Not the first. What did that mean? He stood up abruptly. Rachel watched, helpless. Then he walked to a table in the corner. She could hear the clink of metal. He returned with something in his hand. A knife. Its blade gleamed under the dim light. Rachel's stomach dropped. He took a step toward her, smiling again. Her breath hitched. She had to get out. But how? There was no way. The door was locked. She was alone. With him. The man's grin widened. "I'm going to make it last," he said softly. Rachel's mind raced. Her pulse hammered in her ears. But before she could think of anything else, the man raised the knife. And the room went dark. Rachel froze. The man crumpled to the floor, the knife slipping from his hand. She could barely process what had just happened. A loud, jagged breath escaped her lips. Her body felt like lead. The figure in the doorway stepped forward. A shadow. Strong, confident. "Are you okay?" The voice was familiar but strained. Rachel blinked, trying to focus. The man who had just saved her was tall, broad-shouldered. He stepped into the light. It was Officer Daniels, the same officer who had been investigating the disappearances in the area. Rachel's eyes widened, confusion flooding her mind. Daniels, how? His expression was unreadable. He glanced down at the man on the floor, then back at her. "I've been following him for weeks. I knew he'd come for you next." Rachel couldn't respond. She was still too shocked. Daniels knelt beside her, gently helping her sit up. "You're safe now," he said softly. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something didn't feel right. She looked at the man on the floor again. His face was twisted in a grotesque sneer. How had he gotten so close? Why hadn't he been caught earlier? Daniel stood up, taking out his phone. "I'm calling for backup," he said, his voice calm. Rachel nodded weakly, but her mind was still reeling. Something was wrong. Daniels stepped out of the room, speaking into the phone. She was alone again. For a moment, she felt a strange calm, but then she heard it, a soft click. Her head whipped around. The man, he was moving. He was getting up. Rachel's heart stopped. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The man's eyes glinted in the low light, his smile returning. He wasn't dead, not even close. And just as she realized what was happening, Daniel's voice echoed from outside the door. "Stay right there, I'll be..." But the sound of his footsteps faded. It was too late that Rachel's legs burned with every step. She didn't dare look back. Her mind was screaming, telling her to keep moving, to run as fast as she could. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her sides still throbbing with pain. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she fumbled for the handle. It was locked. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She twisted the handle again, frantic now, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear Daniel's voice behind her, calm and steady. "You can't escape, Rachel. There's nowhere to go." Her pulse quickened, the walls closing in again. She pushed against the door with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. She had to think. She couldn't be trapped again. With a final, desperate breath, Rachel turned to face him. Daniels was standing there, just a few feet away. The gun was in his hand, but this time there was no smile. His face was cold, almost empty. "Why?" she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes flickered with something almost sad. "Because you were never supposed to make it out, Rachel," he said quietly. "People like you, they never do." His words hit her like a slap. The realization crashed over her. He wasn't just a cop. He was something worse. He was part of the darkness she had been running from. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as he stepped closer. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't just give up. Her eyes darted around the room. The broken glass from the door lay scattered across the floor. A shard caught her eye. She grabbed it. It was jagged, sharp. Her breath caught in her throat as she gripped the glass tighter. Daniels was only a few feet away. She could feel the cold of the shard against her palm. Her hand shook, but she didn't hesitate. Rachel lunged. The glass slashed through the air, cutting across his arm. Daniels grunted in pain, staggering back. For a moment, His grip on the gun faltered. That was all she needed. Rachel turned and shoved her shoulder against the door with everything she had left. It burst open. She didn't look back. The cold night air hit her face like a slap. She stumbled into the darkness, her breath sharp, ragged. She had no plan, no direction, only the instinct to run. Behind her, she could hear Daniel's voice. "Come back. You can't escape." But she didn't stop. The sounds of his pursuit faded, but Rachel didn't slow. Her body felt heavy, but she pushed forward. Every step carried her further away from him, from the nightmare she had just escaped. But deep down, she knew one thing. The darkness wasn't done with her, and Daniels would never stop hunting her. Rachel's legs gave out. She collapsed on the cold pavement, gasping for air. Her body was shaking violently, her mind foggy with fear and exhaustion. She had made it out, barely, but there was no relief. Not yet. She pushed herself up, her hands scraped and bloodied from the fall. Her side throbbed with pain, but she forced herself to move. The night was still, eerily quiet, but something gnawed at her. She had to keep going, had to find safety. Her phone. She fumbled through her pockets, heart pounding in her chest. No service. Nothing. Rachel looked around, desperate. The streets were empty, silent. Nothing but the distant sound of traffic. She couldn't stay here. She forced herself to her feet, staggering forward. The streets twisted before her, unfamiliar, but she kept walking. Every shadow, every passing car made her jump. Her mind was spinning. Daniels. He had to be after her. She couldn't trust anyone. No one was safe. She needed to disappear. She needed to get out of the city. Rachel turned a corner, hoping to find some sign of life. And then she heard it. A car. Approaching fast. She froze, panic flooding her veins. The headlights cut through the darkness, and the car slowed as it neared her. Her heart stopped. Was it him? Was it Daniels? The car stopped beside her, the window rolling down. A familiar face stared back at her. It was Officer Daniels, but this time his expression was different. There was no anger, no menace. His eyes were wide, filled with something else. Fear? Concern? Rachel's mind spun. "What are you doing?" she whispered, voice shaky. "Why are you here?" Daniel's voice cracked, the fear in his words undeniable. "They found me, Rachel. They're coming for both of us." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. He wasn't the predator. He was the prey. And now they were both marked. With no way out, Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, panic surging. She stared at Daniels, her breath quickening. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, as if he had just stepped out of a nightmare and walked right into another. "Who?" she managed to rasp, her voice barely audible. "Who's coming for us?" Daniels glanced over his shoulder, his hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I can feel them watching us." The air felt colder, heavier, as though the night itself had thickened around them. Rachel's eyes darted around the empty street, her senses screaming that something was terribly wrong. She didn't know who Daniels was afraid of, but she knew fear when she saw it, and it was all over his face now. Suddenly, a sound, a faint, unnatural hum, sliced through the silence. Rachel's eyes widened. It came from above. She looked up, her heart dropping into her stomach. A dark figure, not quite human, hovered just above the streetlights. A shadow that seemed to float, not walk, as though it was not bound by the laws of gravity. And then, another sound, the scrape of metal, followed by a low, guttural growl. Daniel's eyes widened in terror. "They've found us," he muttered, voice trembling. "They've found us." Without warning, he threw open the car door. Get in the car now," he shouted. Rachel didn't hesitate. She slammed the door behind her as the car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The shadow followed them, moving impossibly fast, its shape shifting as it closed in on their vehicle. Rachel's blood ran cold as she saw the outlines of several more figures, all converging from different directions, emerging from the darkness like phantoms. Daniel slammed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring as they sped down the street. But no matter how fast they went, the figures kept coming, closing the distance with terrifying ease. "Where are we going?" Rachel gasped, her voice frantic. "What are they?" Daniel's knuckles turned white on the wheel, his eyes wide with terror as he glanced in the rearview mirror. They're not human," he said, his voice cracking. "They're hunters. They've been tracking us for years." Rachel's mind reeled. Hunters? She barely understood what he meant, but the fear in his eyes made it clear that whatever was chasing them was far worse than anything she could have imagined. She looked out the window again. The shadow was now hovering just above the car, moving in sync with them, its form flickering in and out of visibility like a bad memory. "Hold on," Daniels shouted. The car swerved around a corner, tires squealing. But the shadow wasn't backing off. It dove downward, faster than anything humanly possible, crashing into the roof of the car with a sickening thud. Rachel screamed. A high-pitched screech filled the air as the creature began to scrape at the roof, its claws tearing through metal as if it were paper. Daniel swerved again, trying to shake it off, but the thing only dug in deeper, screeching louder. It was getting inside. Rachel's heart raced, the cold sweat on her skin clinging to her. She turned to Daniels, her voice shaking with desperation. "We have to get away. We have to lose it." Daniel's face was pale, his eyes wild with panic. "I don't know how," he said, barely above a whisper. "They always find us. They always catch us." The creature was closer now, its claws nearly penetrating the roof, as it let out another deafening screech. And then everything went silent. A sudden, unnatural stillness settled over them. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against Rachel's chest, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. She glanced at Daniels. His face was pale, frozen in fear. Before she could speak, a voice, deep, distorted, and almost unearthly, echoed inside the car. "You can run," it hissed, "but you can never escape." The voice sent chills through Rachel's spine, cold and hollow, as though it came from deep within the earth itself. Her eyes widened in terror. The creature, no, they weren't just chasing them. They were toying with them. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were almost translucent. "Don't listen to it," he muttered under his breath. "Don't listen." But Rachel couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The shadowy figure above them was no longer just an outline. It had taken form, cloaked in darkness, with eyes like hollow pits, watching them with an unnerving, predatory gaze. She could feel its presence pressing in on her, suffocating her thoughts, like it was inside her mind. Daniel slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching, but the shadow above them didn't move. It didn't need to. In an instant, the creature vanished, slipping from sight as though it had melted into the very air. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Had it given up? But before she could process the sudden silence, the car jerked violently, nearly sending her flying into the dashboard. The road ahead seemed to ripple, as if the asphalt itself was warping. Another creature. No, asterisk more asterisk than one. Rachel's heart dropped. There were dozens of them now, pouring out of the shadows at the edge of the street, their forms flickering, shifting, blending with the darkness. She could see their eyes glowing unnatural, fixed on them. They were everywhere. The car lurched again, as though something large had slammed into it from behind. Daniel swerved, his voice frantic as he spoke. They're inside my head, Rachel. They're inside my head. I can't think straight, I can't. The car swerved again, throwing Rachel to the side. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the deafening noise of the creature's growls. Suddenly, the headlights flickered out. Then the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a slow, grinding halt, and the world went black. Rachel's breath was ragged as she scrambled out of her seat, her fingers trembling as she reached for the door handle. But it wouldn't open. She looked around in panic, her heart racing. The figures were closing in on them, their eyes burning through the darkness. The doors weren't opening. They were trapped. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper, hollow and distant. "They want us," he said, his voice filled with hopelessness. "They always want us." Rachel tried to breathe, but her chest felt tight, as though the very air was being drained from her lungs. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, the creatures began to move closer. Their eyes were upon her now, so close she could feel the heat of their gaze, like the pressure of 1,000 unseen hands. Her body went numb. Daniels looked at her one last time, his face pale, his eyes filled with terror. "It's over," he said quietly, and the world around her crumbled into darkness. The air was suffocating. Rachel's heart thundered in her chest, but she couldn't make a sound. The figures loomed closer, their eyes burning through the blackness. A twisted, unnatural silence filled the air. She could feel them now. Their presence was overwhelming, cold, heavy. 1,000 whispers flooded her mind, each one more distorted than the last. They were in her head, breathing down her neck. Rachel's vision blurred, a sickening dizziness overtaking her senses. She couldn't move. Her body felt paralyzed, as if something unseen was holding her in place. The figures were inches away now. She could hear the scrape of claws against metal, the rasping breath of something too close to human. Daniel's voice was faint, but it still reached her ears. "They'll take us both," he murmured, his voice flat. "There's nothing we can do now." Rachel turned to him, her mouth dry, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't just give up." But Daniels didn't reply. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, as though he was no longer fully present. The creatures were too close now, their forms rippling with malice. Suddenly, one of them stepped forward, its face flickering in and out of view, shifting in impossible ways. Its eyes locked with hers, a deep, hollow stare. And then, without warning, it opened its mouth. A grotesque, unnatural sound filled the air, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. Rachel's whole body trembled, but she couldn't look away. The thing reached out toward her, its clawed fingers brushing against the car window. But before it could touch her, a new sound cut through the tension, a sharp, piercing roar, louder than the creature's, closer. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as a new presence emerged from the darkness. A light, bright, blinding, cutting through the shadows like a knife. The creatures recoiled, their forms flickering as though they were being torn apart by the light. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. Was it an angel? No, it wasn't an angel. A man stepped into the light, tall, strong, with an aura that seemed to push the darkness away. He wore a dark leather coat, his eyes sharp, unwavering as he glanced at her. "Get out of the car. Now." His voice was commanding, but not unkind. Rachel's mind swam with confusion. Who was this man? Where had he come from? But there was no time for questions. She had no choice. The creatures were still hissing, their eyes filled with rage, but they couldn't come any closer, not with the light cutting through the darkness. Rachel pushed open the door, her legs trembling as she stumbled out. She didn't hesitate, running toward the stranger, desperate to escape whatever nightmare she had found herself in. As she reached him, he grabbed her arm, pulling her close. "Stay behind me," he said. "You're not safe yet." Rachel could feel the heat of his body, his presence solid and real in the midst of the chaos. The creatures howled behind them, their voices rising in a terrifying crescendo. But the man didn't flinch. He pulled something from his coat, a blade, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. With one swift motion, he slashed through the air. The creatures shrieked as the light from the blade burned through them, their forms twisting and disintegrating into nothingness. Rachel watched, her body frozen in shock, as the figures were torn apart by the light, vanishing into the air like smoke. And then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The night fell silent once more. The man lowered the blade, his eyes scanning the darkened street. "They're gone," he muttered under his breath. Rachel stood there, staring at him, her mind racing. What just happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man turned to her, his face unreadable. "It's not over," he said softly, "but for now you're safe. Come with me." Rachel didn't have time to ask more questions. All she knew was that the darkness hadn't gone away, and whatever was coming next would be far worse than anything she had ever faced. The man didn't wait for Rachel to respond. He started walking, his strides long and confident, leading her away from the wrecked car and the remnants of the creatures that had nearly consumed them. Rachel hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the street, still dark and silent, but the threat had dissolved, like fog in sunlight. She had no idea where they were going or who this man was, but something in the way he moved, calm, assured, told her that he knew far more about what was happening than she ever could. She followed him, her legs shaky, adrenaline still surging through her. The cold night air bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy grip of terror that had held her just moments ago. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice low and hesitant. The man didn't turn around, but she could see the muscle in his jaw twitch, like he was debating whether or not to answer. "Name's Samuel," he said curtly, his voice rough. "And I've been hunting them for years." "Them?" Rachel asked, trying to make sense of his words. "The creatures. The hunters." He glanced at her now, eyes narrowed. "They're not just some random monsters, Rachel. They've been around for centuries, feeding off people, tracking them, marking them." Rachel felt a chill, her breath catching in her throat. "Why me?" she asked, the question hanging between them like a heavy weight. Samuel slowed his pace for a moment, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Because you're marked," he said finally, voice flat. "The same way I was once marked. They don't let go. They never do." Rachel's mind reeled. Marked? What did that even mean? She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat as her eyes darted around. There was something off about the night. It felt wrong, like they were being watched, like something was waiting in the shadows for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, Samuel stopped. He turned to face her, his eyes hardening. "You need to trust me," he said, his voice low but insistent. "I'm your only chance at surviving what's coming." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She had no idea who he was, what he was, but he had just saved her life. For now, that had to count for something. Samuel glanced at the horizon, the first light of dawn barely beginning to break over the skyline. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "They'll come for us again, and when they do, you won't be able to run." Rachel took a deep breath, her heart still racing, her mind struggling to process everything. But one thing was clear. Whatever Samuel was talking about, she couldn't outrun it alone. She nodded. "Where do we go?" Samuel's face softened for just a second, a flicker of something human, something not entirely hardened by years of hunting. "Follow me," he said, and without another word, he turned and started walking again, deeper into the night. The darkness had only just begun. Rachel followed Samuel, her footsteps quiet but heavy, the silence between them oppressive. The streets were empty now, void of the horrors that had just stalked them. But she could still feel the weight of them, the unshakable presence of something dark lingering just beyond sight. Samuel led her down narrow alleys, moving with a sense of purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Hunters, creatures, marked. She had always thought monsters were just stories, but now they were real. She glanced at Samuel again, his broad shoulders tense as he moved swiftly through the night. "What happened to you?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't slow his pace, but his eyes flickered toward her, dark and distant. "I was like you once," he said, his voice tight. "Running, hiding, but they always find you." His words were chilling, and Rachel couldn't help but feel the weight of his experiences in his tone. "They come for you, no matter where you go." He glanced ahead, his jaw clenched. "You can try to fight back, but it's never enough." Rachel didn't know how to respond. She didn't know what to say, but his words stuck with her, gnawing at her like a cold, gnawing fear. They'd come for her again, and this time she wasn't sure they'd leave her alive. The city around them grew quieter, almost unnervingly so. It was as if the entire world had fallen into a breathless pause, waiting for something to happen. Samuel stopped suddenly, his head jerking toward the side, eyes scanning the area. Rachel's heart skipped a beat, and her hand instinctively went to her side, where she could still feel the sting of her previous wound. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "Stay close," Samuel muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They're here." Before Rachel could react, a sound cut through the silence. A low growl, a shift in the air, and then movement. Figures emerged from the shadows, their shapes faint at first, but quickly becoming clearer as they neared. At least 3 of them, the same twisted forms she had seen earlier. The hunters. Rachel's stomach dropped, her pulse quickening as she looked at Samuel, who was already moving, positioning himself in front of her. His eyes were dark, resolute. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice low but firm. The creatures moved toward them with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The closer they got, the more their forms twisted and distorted, like reflections in a cracked mirror. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, and her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Samuel stepped forward, his movements fluid and precise, as if he had done this 1,000 times. He pulled something from his coat, a thin, curved blade that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Without a word, he swung it at the nearest creature, cutting through the air with a sharp whistle. The creature screeched, a high-pitched sound that made Rachel's blood run cold. But the blade didn't stop. It cut through the creature's form like a hot knife through butter, and it disintegrated into a cloud of shadow, evaporating into the night air. But there was no time to breathe. 2 more lunged forward. Samuel moved again, faster than Rachel could follow. Each strike of his blade took down a creature, but the remaining ones seemed to multiply, emerging from the shadows around them. Rachel's heart was in her throat as the hunters closed in. She couldn't just stand there. She had to do something. Instinct kicked in. Without thinking, Rachel picked up a broken piece of concrete from the ground, gripping it tightly in her hands. She swung it at one of the creatures, catching it off guard. It screeched, stumbling back, but then it turned its glowing eyes on her, a twisted grin forming on its face. In that moment, Rachel felt the full weight of its malice, the darkness pressing in on her from every angle. But before it could strike, Samuel was there. His blade cut through the air with lightning speed, and the creature crumpled to the ground, dissolving into shadow. Samuel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You've got to keep up," he said, his voice harsh. Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. But she knew this wasn't over, and the darkness wasn't done with her yet. The night was a blur of motion as Samuel moved through the shadows, his blade flashing with every strike. Each swing of the blade seemed to slice through the air like a sharp gust of wind, taking down one creature after another. But they kept coming. The hunters were relentless. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep up, her legs burning, her breath ragged in the cold air. She could feel the weight of their presence, the way the darkness pressed against her skin. The sound of their growls echoed in her mind, a constant reminder that they were never far behind. Samuel was ahead of her now, cutting through the night with precision and speed. He didn't look back, but Rachel couldn't let herself be left behind. She gripped the shard of concrete in her hand tighter, her knuckles white with the effort. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping her moving. She had no plan, no strategy. She was just reacting, her every step fueled by the terror of being caught. Samuel turned sharply down another alley, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his posture tense. "We need to get to the safe house," he said, his voice cold and firm. The words barely registered in Rachel's mind as she followed him, her eyes darting to the figures that still stalked them, trailing just behind. The safe house? Where was it? What was it? But there was no time to ask, no time to question. Samuel kept moving, pushing forward without hesitation, and Rachel had no choice but to follow. A faint glow appeared up ahead, cutting through the darkness. A streetlight. Samuel quickened his pace, and Rachel pushed herself harder, her legs screaming for rest. But then, a loud crash. Rachel spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. One of the hunters had lunged forward, crashing into a nearby trash can, its body contorting as it regained its balance. It was faster than she'd ever seen. Before she could react, it was on her. Its clawed hands reached for her, its twisted face inches from hers. Her breath caught in her throat. But then, Samuel was there. He moved like lightning, slashing the creature's arm with his blade, and it let out a horrified screech, stumbling back, disintegrating into shadow. Samuel didn't pause for a second. "Stay with me," he growled, his voice low and urgent. Rachel nodded, heart pounding. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Everything around her was a blur of darkness and violence. She kept moving. Samuel took a sharp turn, pulling her down another alleyway, his gaze never leaving the shadows. The sounds of the creatures were closer now, louder. Their growls filled the air, each step like thunder in her ears. But just when Rachel thought they were cornered, Samuel pulled open a door, hidden in the side of an old building, and motioned for her to follow. Inside. Now, Rachel didn't question it. She rushed through the door, Samuel closing it behind them with a harsh thud. The darkness of the alleyway was cut off, replaced by a sudden, suffocating silence. They were inside, but Rachel didn't feel safe. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and age. The room they were in was small, cramped. The only light came from a flickering bulb overhead. She could hear the sounds of Samuel's rapid breathing, his movements tense as he checked the locks on the door. "They'll follow us," he said, his voice rough. "They always follow." Rachel stepped back, her mind racing. She could barely keep up with the onslaught of questions, the terror gripping her chest. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A safe house," Samuel replied, his eyes dark. "A temporary one. It won't hold them forever." She didn't understand. How could anything stop those creatures? "How do you know so much about them?" Rachel asked, her voice almost pleading. Samuel hesitated. His gaze shifted to the floor, his jaw tightening. "I've been fighting them for years," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I've lost everything to them. Family, friends, the life I knew. I'm the last one left." The weight of his words hit her harder than anything she'd felt before. She felt a pang of sympathy, a brief flicker of understanding. And then, The distant sound of growls reached her ears. The creatures were near. Samuel's hand shot to the blade at his side, and he looked at her with fierce determination. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice sharp. "We fight together or we die alone." Rachel's pulse raced. She didn't know if she was ready for this, if she ever would be. But one thing was certain. The hunt wasn't over. And there was no escaping it. The growls grew louder, more distinct, as though the creatures were closing in on their position. Rachel's breath came in short, frantic gasps as she watched Samuel prepare, his hands steady as he gripped the glowing blade. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of his words sinking in. "We fight together, or we die alone." She didn't want to die. Not like this. Not in a small, dark room, hunted by creatures she could barely understand. Samuel moved toward the far wall, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The room was sparsely furnished, the walls worn with age, but it felt like the safest place she had been since this nightmare started. He pulled a small, rusted crate from beneath a table, its contents clattering as he opened it. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, a harsh whisper. "They're here." Rachel's pulse quickened as she glanced at the door. The faint scratches began, low at first, but steadily growing louder. The creatures were at the door. Samuel didn't flinch. He began pulling out weapons from the crate, small explosive devices, an extra blade, a crossbow with arrows tipped in something dark and glistening. Rachel stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for the wall as she tried to steady herself. Her mind raced. She hadn't signed up for any of this. The scraping of claws against metal made her stiffen, and she glanced toward the door. "Are we really going to fight them?" she asked, her voice trembling, disbelief in every syllable. Samuel looked at her, his eyes piercing through the dim light, hardened by years of battle. "You don't have a choice," he said flatly. "I've been fighting these things for too long to stop now. And if you don't fight, they'll take you. All of you." She swallowed, her throat dry, her mind a haze of fear and confusion. "What are they?" she asked, the question burning in her mind. "Monsters, hunters, whatever you want to call them," Samuel muttered, tightening his grip on his blade. "But they're not just things from the dark. They're ancient. They've been hunting people for centuries." Rachel's heart raced. She could hardly breathe, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a heavy stone. They were ancient. Her whole world had just shattered. The creatures at the door screeched, their claws digging into the wood as they tried to force entry. Samuel glanced at her, his gaze steady, but there was something else in his eyes now, something she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the hard edge of someone who had seen too much. It was determination. "Stay behind me," he said again, his tone sharp. Rachel nodded, her legs shaking beneath her. She gripped the piece of concrete again, her fingers numb as she held it tightly. The door creaked as the creatures scratched harder. A terrifying, guttural growl echoed through the small room, sending a shiver down her spine. They were close. So close. The creatures were clawing their way in. Samuel moved to the center of the room, pulling the crossbow in front of him. He aimed toward the door, his face calm and unreadable. "Get ready," he said. Before Rachel could respond, the door exploded inward, the force of the impact shaking the walls and throwing debris across the room. The first creature came charging through, its dark, twisted form moving with terrifying speed. Its eyes glowed with hunger, its mouth open in a monstrous grin. It was followed by two more, slithering through the debris like shadows, their claws scraping against the floor as they advanced toward them. Samuel didn't hesitate. He fired the crossbow, the bolt flying through the air with a loud thwack before embedding itself in the creature's chest. The first creature screeched, its body jerking back violently as it dissolved into shadow, leaving only a faint trace of smoke behind. But the other two didn't stop. Rachel's heart slammed in her chest as she raised the shard of concrete, ready to strike if one of them came for her. The creatures hissed, their twisted faces contorting in rage. One lunged toward Samuel, its claws aimed for his throat. With a quick swipe of his blade, Samuel sliced through the air, cutting the creature down with ease. It too dissolved into shadow, but the last one was faster. It darted past Samuel, headed straight for Rachel. Her breath caught in her throat as the creature's glowing eyes locked onto hers, a hiss escaping its twisted mouth. It was too fast. She couldn't move. In that moment, time seemed to slow. But then, Samuel was there, his arm flying in front of her, his blade slicing through the air. The creature shrieked as the blade made contact, its body crumpling to the floor in a heap of shadow and smoke. Rachel froze, her chest heaving with panic and relief, as Samuel stood over her, his blade dripping dark mist. It was over. For now. Samuel turned to her, his face unreadable. "Get your bearings," he said. "This isn't the end." Rachel nodded, her hands trembling. She didn't know if she was ready for whatever was coming next. But one thing was clear. There was no going back now. And whatever hunted them, it wasn't finished yet. The room was still, the echoes of the creature's screeches fading into the distance. Rachel's body felt frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. The reality of the situation hit her like a wave. They're just getting started. She looked at Samuel, his form casting a long shadow in the flickering light of the bulb above. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes were focused, calculating. "You okay?" he asked, his voice still rough but softer now. Rachel nodded, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She wasn't sure if she was okay. She had just fought for her life against creatures that defied logic and nature. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, though her voice cracked. Samuel didn't seem convinced. His gaze softened, just for a moment, before he turned away, scanning the room again. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The safe house won't hold for long." Rachel blinked. "What do you mean?" "They'll find us." He moved to a corner of the room, pulling a tattered map from his coat pocket and spreading it out on a small table. His fingers traced over the paper with an intensity that unsettled her. "There are places we can hide, but not for long. They track us, Rachel. Always." Her heart sank as she looked at the map. She had no idea what any of it meant, lines, symbols, markings that didn't make sense. But she knew one thing. Samuel wasn't afraid of what was out there. He was used to it, but she wasn't. "How do we stop them?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure she even believed in an answer. Samuel paused for a beat, his hand hovering over the map. "We don't stop them. We survive." He met her gaze. For now, the weight of his words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, Rachel didn't know what to say. Was that really all they could do? Asterisk survive asterisk? Before she could respond, the sound of scratching came again, louder this time, coming from somewhere outside. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, every nerve in her body on edge. Samuel's expression darkened. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. He grabbed his blade again and turned to her with that same urgent, commanding look. "We have to go. Now." Rachel's heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to nod. There was no choice. She had to move. She had to keep up with him. They darted toward the back door of the building, Samuel leading the way, his movements swift and silent. Rachel's body felt like it was moving on autopilot, her mind still grappling with the overwhelming reality of everything that had happened. They reached the door, and Samuel paused for just a moment to check the locks, making sure everything was secure. The sounds of scratching and growling outside grew louder, more frenzied. Samuel turned to her, his face set in a grim mask. "Follow me closely. Don't make a sound." Rachel nodded, her throat dry. She followed him into the alleyway behind the building, the cold air biting at her skin as they moved quickly, staying low, their footsteps barely a whisper. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for them both to fit. She could hear the creatures now, their growls muffled but unmistakable, just beyond the shadows. They were close. Samuel led her down another winding path, pulling her through alley after alley, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, alert to every sound, every shift in the darkness. It was almost like he had memorized this city, knew exactly where to go to avoid the things that hunted them. Rachel, on the other hand, felt more lost with every step. She had no idea where they were going or why. She was just following Samuel, trusting that he knew what he was doing. They reached a dead end, and for a moment, Rachel thought they were trapped. But Samuel didn't stop. Without hesitation, he pressed his hand against the wall, revealing a hidden door in the brick, blending seamlessly into the surroundings. "This way," he whispered urgently. Rachel followed him into a cramped underground passage, the air thick with dust and dampness. The door slammed shut behind them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. Samuel took a deep breath and turned to face her, his expression hardening again. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and serious. "They'll find us. They'll never stop." Rachel stood in the dim light, looking at him, this man who had saved her, who had pulled her through the worst of the night. And yet he was right. It wasn't over, and as the silence settled around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was waiting just beyond the next door. The air in the underground passage was thick and suffocating. Every breath felt heavier than the last, as if the darkness itself was pressing in on her chest. Rachel tried to steady her nerves, her hands trembling from both fear and exhaustion. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the weight of Samuel's words echoed in her mind. They'll never stop. Samuel moved further into the passage, his steps silent against the concrete floor. His face remained unreadable, his posture rigid, as though the very act of moving through this place was a reminder of the constant battle he'd been fighting for years. Rachel followed him, each step more uncertain than the last. The walls of the passage seemed to close in around them, dimly lit by flickering lights overhead. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and something else, something metallic that made her stomach churn. They reached a set of stairs at the far end, leading even deeper into the earth. Samuel paused at the bottom, listening intently. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She strained her ears, trying to pick up any sound, any hint of what was coming. But all she heard was silence. She swallowed hard. "Is it safe here?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended, as if speaking too loud might make something in the darkness take notice. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, looking down the long, winding corridor that stretched out before them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "For now. But I can't promise it'll stay that way." Rachel's gut twisted, the sense of dread growing with every word. They moved deeper into the tunnels, the sound of their footsteps muted by the thick stone walls. As they walked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows just beyond her reach. Her skin crawled, and her breath quickened with the suffocating sense of unease. Finally, Samuel stopped, turning to her with a sharp look. "Stay here," he said, voice hard. "I need to check the perimeter. Don't move." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but one look at his face silenced her. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. She watched as he disappeared around a corner, his form swallowed by the darkness. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stood alone, the silence pressing in on her like a thick blanket. The longer she waited, the more she could feel the tension building in the air. Her nerves were on edge, her mind playing tricks on her as every creak of the walls made her jump. The growls from earlier still echoed in her ears, haunting her thoughts. They had barely escaped with their lives. But Samuel, Samuel seemed to know what he was doing. Didn't he? She pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing, but her thoughts kept racing. What if they were wrong? What if this safe house wasn't safe at all? Her mind was spinning when she heard it. A faint scraping sound, something moving in the darkness. Her stomach dropped as she turned her head slowly, trying to peer through the dim light. Nothing. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound came again, a low, unsettling, scraping noise from deeper within the tunnel. Her heart skipped a beat. This time, it was louder, closer. Rachel backed away, her eyes wide, searching for any sign of Samuel, but there was no sign of him. The scratching continued, growing louder. It wasn't just one creature now. It was a group, the sound of multiple claws dragging along stone. She turned and ran down the corridor, panic surging through her. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, and the growls came with them, faint but unmistakable. She had to find Samuel. She had to... A hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her back against the wall. Rachel gasped, her breath catching in her throat, but then she saw him. Samuel. His eyes were wild, his breathing ragged, and he had a look on his face that sent a chill down her spine. "They're here," he hissed, his grip tightening on her arm. Rachel's blood ran cold as she heard the creature's growls echo through the corridor, louder than before. She didn't even think. She didn't hesitate. Samuel shoved her toward a small door at the end of the tunnel, his voice low but urgent. "Go. Now." She didn't question him. She ran. The creatures were closing in, the sounds of their claws scraping the walls, echoing in the passage. Rachel slammed through the door into a small, dimly lit room beyond. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew this was no safe house. It was a trap. A cold, metallic scent filled the air. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and there were devices, machines, wires, things she couldn't even begin to understand. It wasn't a refuge. It was a cage, and she was locked inside.
Samuel slammed the door behind them, but his eyes were frantic, scanning the room for an exit. "Stay close," he muttered, but there was something in his voice now, something she couldn't quite place. She backed into a corner, her heart racing. Something was wrong. Samuel turned to her, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. "Get ready," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a trap. And they know we're here." Rachel's blood ran cold. And then the door behind them exploded open. The creatures poured in, their glowing eyes gleaming in the darkness. There was no escape. The door splintered into pieces as the creatures flooded into the room, their twisted forms looming in the shadows. Their eyes gleamed with a hunger that sent a chill through Rachel's entire body. She barely had time to react before Samuel pushed her aside, grabbing his blade with one hand and pulling a small device from his coat with the other. His eyes locked onto her, and his voice was firm, urgent. "Don't look away. Whatever happens, stay focused." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her breath coming fast and shallow. The creatures moved quickly, their claws scraping against the concrete floor as they circled them like predators. She wanted to scream, to run, but the instinct to survive kept her rooted to the spot. Samuel was already in motion. He swung his blade with practiced precision, cutting through one of the creatures with a swift, clean strike. The creature screeched in agony before dissolving into shadow, its form evaporating like mist in the air. But more emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting and warping in the dim light. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, searching for any way out. There had to be something, anything they could use to defend themselves. Her gaze locked onto a metal pipe sticking out of the wall. It wasn't much, but it was something. She lunged for it, pulling it free with a sharp yank, the metal groaning under the strain. The creatures were closer now. Too close. Samuel's blade met one of them head-on, but another lunged toward Rachel, its mouth gaping wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. She swung the pipe wildly, connecting with its side and sending it stumbling back with a hiss of pain. But it didn't stop. "Rachel!" Samuel shouted, his voice strained. He was fighting off two creatures at once, his blade flashing through the air with terrifying speed. She didn't wait for him to finish the warning. She swung again, the pipe connecting with the creature's skull with a sickening thud. The thing staggered back, its body dissolving into black smoke. But more kept coming. Rachel's pulse raced, her every muscle screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The creatures were relentless. She swung the pipe again, this time at another one that was creeping up behind Samuel. It shrieked as the metal connected, but this time it didn't disappear into smoke. It faltered, stumbling, but stayed standing. Samuel glanced over, his eyes flashing with sudden realization. "Asterisk move, asterisk," he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back as the creature lunged at them, its claws outstretched. The impact sent them both crashing to the floor, but Samuel was already rolling back onto his feet, pulling Rachel up with him. The room was chaos. Creatures all around them, moving too quickly for her to keep up. She was dizzy, breathless, her vision blurring as she tried to stay on her feet. And then, just when she thought they might be overrun, Samuel pulled something from his belt, a small grenade-like device, glowing faintly in the dark. He didn't hesitate. He tossed it into the center of the room with a grim expression. "Cover your ears," he shouted. Rachel's instincts kicked in, and she clamped her hands over her ears just as a blinding flash filled the room. The explosion was deafening, a burst of light and force that knocked her off her feet. She gasped for air, vision swimming as the sound of the blast faded into a ringing silence. When she could finally focus again, she saw the creatures lying motionless on the ground. They were gone. But the room was destroyed. The walls were cracked, the floor scorched, and she could feel the heat still radiating from the explosion, even though the air was thick with the smell of burned metal and smoke. Samuel was standing, though he was clearly exhausted, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "We don't have much time." Rachel couldn't catch her breath. Her legs were shaking, her heart racing in the aftermath of the explosion. She tried to push herself up, but her arms felt like they were made of lead. What happened?" she managed to croak. Samuel's gaze darkened, his expression grim. "They'll be back. And now they know we're here. We have to move." Rachel felt the weight of his words sink in. The safe house had been a lie. The trap had been set. And now there was no place to hide. No refuge left. Before she could process the reality of it, Samuel was already moving toward the door, his eyes scanning the shadows once more. "Come on," he urged, grabbing her arm and pulling her along. "We need to get out of here.
Now."
Rachel's legs felt like they might give way under her, but she forced herself to keep moving, following him as he navigated through the maze of broken corridors. The world outside was just as dark as it had ever been, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was getting worse. They were deeper in now, in places she didn't recognize, in tunnels that seemed to stretch on forever. The further they went, the more she could feel the creatures closing in. They were never far behind. And as the weight of their pursuit pressed down on her, Rachel realized with growing terror that there would be no escape. They were being hunted. And this time, there was no place left to run. The tunnels stretched endlessly before them, the dim light from Samuel's flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. Rachel's mind raced, her thoughts scattered as she tried to keep up. The weight of their situation was crushing, a suffocating pressure that made every step feel heavier than the last. The creatures were still out there, lurking in the shadows, tracking them. And no matter how fast they ran, they were always just a step behind. Samuel moved like a shadow, his movements precise, practiced. He didn't slow down for her. His urgency was palpable, his every muscle tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Rachel could hear the scrape of claws against stone again, faint but unmistakable. Her pulse spiked. "They're close," she whispered, her voice shaky. Samuel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew. They moved deeper into the tunnel, their footsteps quick but quiet. Every time Rachel thought she could catch her breath, another noise echoed from behind them.
A growl.
A hiss. The unmistakable sound of something moving in the dark. It wasn't just one creature anymore. There were more. Much more. She had no idea how long they had been running. Time felt like it had stopped, like the world was frozen in this never-ending chase. Every inch of the passage felt the same, narrow, cold, oppressive. The walls closed in on her, the darkness pressing against her mind. "Samuel," she gasped, her voice barely more than a breath. "Where are we going?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He just kept moving, his eyes scanning every corner, every crevice, like he expected something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "There's a way out," he said finally, his voice tight. "We're almost there." But Rachel wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. They rounded another corner, and this time, the growls were louder, closer. She could feel the vibration of their voices in her chest, the hairs on her arms standing up. Her breath hitched as she saw the shadows shift ahead of them. Too many, too fast. The creatures were right in front of them. Samuel barely had time to react. He pulled her to the side, pushing her into a narrow alcove. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low and fierce. Rachel's eyes widened as she watched him face the creatures alone. His stance was strong, unshaken, but even he couldn't fight them all off at once. The first one lunged, claws outstretched, but Samuel was faster. His blade sliced through the air, and the creature disintegrated into black smoke, its screech echoing in the narrow tunnel. But it wasn't enough. Two more emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing like coals in the darkness. Samuel swore under his breath, retreating back a few steps as he readied himself for the next attack. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as she watched. She wanted to help, but her body felt frozen in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. The creatures advanced, their mouths opening wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Samuel," she shouted, panic rising in her throat. "There's too many." He didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the creatures. With a swift motion, he hurled one of the small explosive devices at the approaching creatures. It detonated with a flash, sending a wave of heat through the corridor. The blast momentarily stunned the creatures, their forms flickering in the light, but they quickly recovered. And then, from the corner of her eye, Rachel saw something. A shadow moving behind Samuel. Something bigger. Her heart skipped a beat. She barely had time to scream. A massive creature, larger than anything they had seen before, lunged from the shadows. Its form was a twisted amalgamation of flesh and shadow, its eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to burn into Rachel's very soul. It grabbed Samuel by the arm, its claws digging into his skin. He shouted in pain, but his expression didn't falter. With a growl, he twisted his body, his blade slashing at the creature's side. But it barely flinched. Rachel's stomach twisted in horror as she watched the beast pull Samuel off his feet, lifting him high into the air. Her body moved before she could think, instinct overriding fear. She grabbed the nearest piece of debris, some twisted metal rod, and ran toward the creature, her heart in her throat. "Samuel," she screamed, her voice raw with terror. Samuel's eyes met hers just as the creature tightened its grip on him, its sharp claws piercing through his armor. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes were full of something else. Hope. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Rachel didn't hesitate. She swung the metal rod with all her strength, aiming for the creature's head. The rod hit its mark, cracking against the creature's skull with a sickening sound. It screamed, a deafening, gut-wrenching sound that reverberated through the walls. The creature's grip loosened just enough for Samuel to break free, rolling to the side as the massive beast staggered back. Rachel's heart pounded in her ears. But she didn't stop. She grabbed Samuel's arm and pulled him toward the small alcove where they had hidden before. The creature shrieked again, but this time, they were too far ahead. It roared in frustration, but it didn't follow them. For a brief moment, the world was still. Rachel and Samuel collapsed against the wall, breathless, covered in sweat and blood. The silence that followed was deafening, but it wasn't comforting. Samuel looked at her, his face pale but determined. "That thing won't stop," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we will. We have to keep moving. And we can't stop until we're out of here." Rachel nodded, her mind spinning. But one thing was clear. They were in this fight together. And there was no going back now. They didn't have much time. The creatures' roars were still ringing in their ears, a chilling reminder that they weren't safe, not yet. Rachel's hands trembled as she helped Samuel to his feet, his body battered but still moving with purpose. The adrenaline was fading, but the threat was not. They had been lucky, too lucky, and luck had a way of running out. "Which way?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Her throat felt raw, every word a struggle, but she forced herself to focus. Samuel's eyes scanned the passage ahead, sharp and calculating. "That way," he muttered, pointing toward a narrow opening in the stone wall, barely visible in the dim light. "We go through the ventilation system. It leads outside." Rachel didn't question him. She didn't have the energy to. All she wanted was to get out, to escape the nightmare they were trapped in. Samuel moved first, crouching low as he approached the opening. Rachel followed, her heart pounding with each step, as if the shadows themselves were reaching for her. They didn't speak. There was no need. They both knew what was at stake. The opening was small, and they had to crawl through, the walls pressing in on them. The air was thick with dust and decay, but they didn't stop. Samuel's movements were sure, practiced, and Rachel's were frantic. She had no idea where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. Minutes, maybe hours passed, the time becoming a blur. The growls of the creatures seemed to follow them, no matter how far they crawled, always just behind them. Then, suddenly, the passage opened into a large chamber. And, before they could react, they were surrounded. The creatures had caught up. Samuel's eyes widened in realization. They weren't just being hunted anymore, they were being herded. Rachel barely had time to draw in a breath before one of the creatures lunged at her, claws raking across her arm. She screamed. But Samuel was already moving, already fighting.
He slashed at the creature with his blade, his movements fast, precise, but the creatures were closing in too quickly. There were too many of them. Rachel grabbed for anything she could find, a broken pipe, a chunk of debris, anything to defend herself. But there was no escape. The creatures circled, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey, their growls growing louder with each passing second. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Rachel felt it, a shift in the air, a sudden change. The creatures froze, their heads tilting as though sensing something she couldn't. Samuel stopped fighting, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. Behind them, the wall began to crumble. A figure stepped through the debris, tall and cloaked in darkness, its presence overwhelming. "You're not alone," the figure said, its voice cold but strangely familiar. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and as the figure stepped forward, the creatures hesitated, their growls turning to whispers. It was him, a man they had never seen before, but who, somehow, they knew. "You've been running for too long," he said, his eyes scanning them with a detached gaze. "But now it's time to end this." And in that moment, Rachel realized the truth. This was never about survival. It was about something far worse. And they had just stepped into the heart of the darkness.